Hi everyone, I'm James from F9 Audio and the Freemasons, and in this video we want to talk about the origins of techno. Then we're going to go on a quick sound design exercise, and I'm going to show you how you can take anything that's pretty much around in your studio and come up with something completely original. And then use the tools inside your DAW of choice to actually start to chop all of this kind of information back up and start to build a track with it.
Coming very near.
Techno is one of the most far-reaching forms of electronic dance music, and once again we're actually able to pinpoint the geographical location and time of its origin. Now this time it's the home of the American motor industry, Detroit in Michigan. Now, techno may have a similar rhythm base to house music, in other words a 4/4 rhythm with a kick drum on every single one of those beats, but it has a completely different design ethic. If house is a feeling, then techno is a landscape, and it's a reaction, an artistic statement about the actual automated world that we live in. It's kind of half machine and half human. Now, let's look quickly at the name, because this may even have a literary reference. In 1980, an author called Alvin Toffler wrote a book called The Third Wave. Now, he was talking about waves of technology coming forward and brushing aside any of the society that had lived before it. For him, the second wave was the Industrial Revolution that had changed the way human beings operated and how we manufactured things, and had pushed aside the more manual labour techniques that had come from the society before. The third wave, and the actual point of the book, is Alvin talking about the incoming information age. He saw computers starting to develop and foresaw an actual technology and a new society that would lay waste to anything that had come before it. Now, I may be seeming to be slightly off topic here, but Juan Atkins, one of the godfathers of techno, has actually cited this as a major influence. And there is one phrase within the book, the techno rebels, that he says influenced him to name the music that he was starting to create. Now, every new emerging genre can often be considered a melting pot of other ideas. And with its standard beat aesthetic of 4 electronic kick drums, one on every beat of a standard bar, you can see how easily early house was having a major influence on this new style. And of course it was all over the actual radio stations and in the clubs from when these guys were actually starting to work together. But the other main ingredient that really became one of the cornerstones of techno was a movement that was starting to happen thousands of miles away. The avant-garde music of Europe that had been developing throughout the late 70s had given way to some revolutionary new forms of music, including electronica and music concrete. Now, because an awful lot of this music had never really been heard before, and we need to really pay attention to the fact here, before all music was created by live or amplified instruments, and here it's purely coming out of the circuits of electronica. So some of this music was really starting to gain international appeal and was starting to bubble up underground on a worldwide level. Now, we can't talk about the origins of techno without one of the most influential German electronica artists, and we're talking about Kraftwerk. Now, they were making concept albums about the world that they saw around them, the highways, the train systems, the automation, the factories, and as soon as computers started, they really kind of were able to almost bring that into a musical form. And just listen to 1980's release, Computer World, to see exactly how they started an awful lot of the processes and techniques, and particularly some of the noise-based rhythm sounds that are still in use by techno and all sorts of electronica producers today.
I programmed my own computer, beam myself into the future.
In the pre-internet days, the only way that music travelled across borders was via radio. And certain underground radio stations in America were bringing this music that was coming out of Europe, but they were also playing it next to the crazy electric funk that was coming out of towns like Minneapolis and the beginnings of the post-disco era from New York. All of this new music being played on underground radio stations really affected and directly inspired 3 men that were working out of their basements effectively in Michigan. The 3 godfathers of the original techno scene, the Belleville 3, Juan Atkins, Derek May and Kevin Saunderson. One of my favourite early recordings from around this period is Juan Atkins' No UFOs. And you can really hear, once you actually break down some of the melody parts, his influence of the sound that was coming out of Germany from Kraftwerk.
Told me it was alright. You said I should not fear things you haven't seen before. I'm coming very near.
But a lot of the early techno records had an awful lot more house reference points than might be considered acceptable in today's techno music. And a perfect example of that is Derek May's Strings of Life, which has the traditional strings and piano instrumentation that has come to really define house music. Now, we can actually describe the origins of techno in the words of the three originators themselves, who once described the music they were creating as George Clinton and Kraftwerk trapped in a lift with nothing more than a sequencer to keep them company. Now, that kind of mixture of electronica, sequenced rhythms, completely computer-controlled rhythms, and funk has been a defining sound throughout the history and all of the different subgenres of techno, and is clearly evident on all of the records still released today. The first techno record I actually heard in the wild was Energy Flash by Joey Beltram, a New York producer, who had really taken on the music that he was hearing from the southern states of America and put his own spin on it. Now, it had actually been released for quite a while by this point, but I was amazed at hearing it as a young clubber for the first time, and the absolutely enormous power of the record, the power of the main riff, its hypnotic and almost trance-inducing effect on the crowd, and most importantly, its utter machine-like relentlessness. Now, there is no one particular way to go about a techno production, and for me, it's as close to electronic self-expression as you can get, and has parallels to the late 70s experimental jazz scene. And I'll never forget sitting on a kind of young producer panel with what is considered the dark knight of the UK techno scene, Dave Clark. And he was hammering into these young producers, work on your sounds, and then come back to them a few days later and then work on them some more. Because pure techno is as much about sound design as it is about creating grooves that will work in clubs. Now, when we're talking about sound design within techno, don't expect to kind of master this instantly. You'll find that people will spend years and years developing their own particular blend or their own particular style of the subgenres within techno. And it can almost be seen the same kind of transition that a musician might make learning an instrument over the course of 4 or 5 years. But if I were to try and sum up its creation, for me, techno is the perfect balance between human analog inspiration and the digital technology around it. Now, for me, a shining example of this kind of mixture between analog and digital sound is Road's 2014 remix of Radio Slave's Repeat Myself. Now, even though all of its instrumentation is completely electronic and it was obviously made in a computer, it seems to have a real analog heart. And it's a perfect example of how the modern Berlin techno scene really brings together both elements, the human element and the digital element. Now, this video could go on literally for days as we start to talk about the creation of the various subgenres within techno. But let's actually work at its base aesthetic, which is sound design and the kind of reaction to the mechanized and increasingly automated world that we have around us. But a great starting point for a techno production may be to actually kind of almost forget the sequencer for a moment and look around your studio, see what you've got that makes a noise that you can plug into the computer, maybe in a chamber something else, and start on a sound design route that will make sure that whatever you're putting into your track is completely unique. So I've pulled out a couple of bits from my studio here, and I've got a couple of miniatures. I've got Roland's brilliant JP08, part of the Boutique range, and the Korg Monotron delay here. I got them linked up, and what we're going to do here is just kind of go almost on a sound design exercise or a sound surfing exercise, and we're just going to create a couple of parts or bits that we can actually process later on. I'm not going to be playing them into any kind of track. I'm just really going to be using our DAW Ableton Live almost as a 2-track or stereo recorder, just to capture whatever we come up with. And here, think about it of taking the gloves off. Just muck around with what you've got. There's no particular design ethic because everyone's take on what they may want, what consider to be a good sound is going to be totally different. But I'm going to start here with just some rhythm elements. So I've just started Ableton recording, and it's pretty much now going to record anything that goes into it. But I'm going to start to try and make a kind of snare sound, and I'm going to use a mixture of short delays and feedback and cut off from this Korg Monotron. Now I find with percussion or percussive elements, really short delays with quite a bit of feedback can almost give you, when you tune it just right, almost like a spring reverb effect, which can be incredibly useful as you're starting to put rhythm parts together. Now let me just play with the actual controls on the synth. Now I've just done quite a long pass there, but this is all going to be edited later on, and it's kind of great fun to just completely muck around totally free without any of the constraints that you might normally have in your production life, and just play with the instruments that you've got. You can always then go back and chop them up, which is exactly what I'm going to do with this set of sounds. Now let's start looking at some more tonal stuff, and the reason I picked the JP08 is it's got a brilliant cross modulation circuit within it, and we're going to try and look at that and see what kind of sounds we can get out of that to actually put back into Ableton's simpler and sampler plugins later on. So let me just start Ableton again. Now, when you're actually starting to put more melodic based things in with a view of turning it into a sampler patch later on, it's probably always a good idea to actually start sampling around the note of C. Now the cross modulation is going to throw some of that pitching out, but it's a great starting point for actually collecting everything, because most of the sampler patches will default to a C tuning once you start to put it back in. That's the great thing about the cross modulation circuit on the Jupiter, is that you can really dig into it, even slightly better than it would be on a vintage Jupiter, which always suffers from most of its voices being slightly offset. This is as a Jupiter 8 should have been leaving the factory. Now the other thing that I'm going to try and capture are a couple of chords. I'm going to use pretty much minor key voicings for these chords, but let's just see what we can get out of this. We're getting a lot of distortion here, so I'm just going to drop the output level. Now I've just found a slightly more percussive sound here, so I'm going to take a couple of versions of that in, with a little gap in between them, and just some modulations on the monotron delay cutoff. Now, although that may seem fairly chaotic, I do encourage you to try it on pretty much any genre of music that you're working on, because sometimes being completely free of the technical constraints that are normally in your brain when you're working inside a DAW, and just actually playing physically with the equipment that you've got, can really bring out sounds that you'd never create within the context of a plugin. Now let me show you how to use Ableton's built-in tools to change this into a series of menu patches and chromatic patches that you can actually use to build a track.